is joining us to share her work about idols and idolatry. And I think this is just fascinating material and such an interesting time to talk about this topic. And Caitlin, I'm so glad for your presence here with us today and for your leadership. Caitlin is a PhD candidate in Hebrew Bible at Emory University, and her work engages conceptions of divinity within the Hebrew Bible and the ancient Near East. Her dissertation is titled Deutero-Isaiah's Aniconic Logic. Did you get all that? Divine Ontology and the Image Fabrication Parodies. I'm so glad you're working on this.
Yeah.
She's investigating assumptions about divine nature, embodiment, and representation in Isaiah. But according to Caitlin, when she's not nerding out about ancient Near Eastern rituals, you might find her chasing her 14-month-old daughter up the stairs, analyzing the personalities of reality dating show contestants, or consuming unhealthy amounts of sour candy. So, a well-rounded guest today, and I'm so glad that Caitlin is here with us. Please join me in making her welcome.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Carmi. I'm so grateful for all of your welcoming spirit to me today. Let's go ahead and say a prayer before we begin, shall we? Dear God, I thank you so much for this congregation and their love for you and their love for your word, their love for this world. And I pray that through this study, we can learn to love you better, love you in a more pure way, and that we can follow you in these confusing times. And thank you for your guidance and your love for us. In your name we pray, amen. Amen. Well, thank you again for having me. I feel so welcomed by you all just in the short time I've been here with you. Somebody got me a welcome bag. Somebody got me Sam's lemon blueberry cake. I was offered coffee. I was offered the Lord's Supper. What more could you want? Right? So I'm grateful for that. As Carmi said, I am a PhD candidate at Emory University, and I'm writing on the complicated things, Second Isaiah's Aniconic Logic, whatever. It's really about idolatry. It's really in the Old Testament, what did it mean when people worshiped other gods? What did it mean for them to be accused of these things? And the reason I'm interested in that is because I'm interested as a Christian today in how do we look around the world and notice these same impulses in ourselves and in one another and in our world. So even though I'm interested in the ancient context, it's very much rooted in concern for the present moment. So I also like to be interactive. I hope that's okay. Do you guys like to talk? I was told you like to talk. So I hope that that'll be okay. Okay, so I have a question for you first of all. And it's probably a little basic, but what do you think of when you hear the term idol or idolatry? Can you tell me what that is for you?
The worship of money.
The worship of money. Yes, I was talking to Judy over there. She was bringing us to the final day of the class already, bringing these analogies to modern day idols. I think money is a great one. Any other ideas? Maybe more conceptually, what does it mean to be worshiping idols?
Be obsessed.
Wow. Okay, the word obsessed, so it's a certain inordinate desire for a particular thing, maybe. Other thoughts? Yeah.
I think it's like kind of when you have something that you're using as a guide or a light in your journey that is misaligned with God.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so again, more about your orientation to the subject itself or the object. Something about your appetite for the thing that is outside of maybe what God would ideally have. Other thoughts? These are great. We're going to be touching on each of these ideas as we go through the class. Yeah?
Something that we worship in place of God.
Okay, interesting. So now you're telling me an idol is not so much about my personal desire for the thing, but it has something to do with the thing in itself. There are certain things that should not be the object of a certain kind of desire. So I'm glad we got to hear sort of both of those. There's something about idolatry that seems to both have something to do with my orientation to the thing being out of place, as well as the thing itself being wrong. So we're going to look at both of those as we go through the class. All right, so anybody else into etymology? Yeah? Anybody? Can I get an amen? Thank you. So, if you look up the term idolatry in the Bible, it's not there. It's actually a Greek cognate that we have idolatry, the English word from. And it's based on these two words, idol, and then worship. So those two words together come up with our English term for idolatry, but it's not actually present in Hebrew. And so that's an interesting thing. So we're in this class going to try to, as much as we're focusing on the modern day, look at that through the ancient context and think, how were people in the Old Testament thinking about these same issues, and how can that help inform us today? So there's going to be some terms that we cover in this class that I want to just flag for you because they can be a little intimidating. Iconism is a term that's used to describe religions which use images in worship. Those can be different kinds of images. Sometimes they can be symbols, images of gods, images of people, but those religions are referred to as iconist cults. There's aniconism, the opposite, which is the opposition to uses of images in worship. That's traditionally what the position of Judaism and some forms of Protestant Christianity are opposed to using images in worship. Interestingly, there's a big debate about the extent to which ancient Israel actually was beholden to this position. So even though we see throughout the Bible a lot of prohibitions on the use of images, it's really interesting to compare that with archaeological findings of particularly during the pre-exilic period of Israel, which seem to suggest it seems like some people were actually okay with this. And in fact, maybe that's why there are all of these prohibitions in the Bible, is because it was actually a controversial issue. You know, you don't tend to hammer down on something endlessly unless you view it as necessary to do that. So we'll touch on that again throughout the class, but just know that is a contested issue in the history of Israelite religion. So you have iconism, you have aniconism, and then you have iconoclasm. So whereas aniconism is opposition to use of images, iconoclasm is more destructive and polemical. So this is some of the texts that I work in 2nd Isaiah. They're called the anti-idol polemics, but it's basically those texts where the prophet says, you cut down the tree, half of it you roast meat on, half of it you make into a god. You're so dumb, basically. It's the anti-idol polemics. It's making fun of the production of images. So we would call that iconoclastic rhetoric, because not only is it opposed to images, it's actually actively destroying them in a rhetorical sense. Okay, those terms make sense? We good? Okay. So with those terms, I want to talk a little bit about the terms that do appear in the Old Testament with regard to images. So the main phrase that shows up is not idolatry, but it's called avodah Elohim acharim, worship of other gods. So you might think, oh, that's the same thing as idolatry. Well, is it? Partially. Were you going to say something? Yeah.
I mean, we hear the phrase false idols, so that implies there might be true idols.
Very interesting. Yeah, so what I think comes to light in this difference of terminology is that what we call idolatry, sometimes we call it that for one of two reasons. Either we're worshiping the wrong God, or we're worshiping the right God in the wrong way. So for example, Is it okay to make an image of Yahweh according to the Old Testament? No. Even though it's not an image of another god, you would think that that might be okay, right? It's kind of unusual for there to be a religion which deliberately prohibits the use of images, because you can imagine it being a way to make the divine present in your circumstance, right? You can imagine that being a good thing. So we're gonna, in this class, critically look at what exactly was the reason that the authors of the Old Testament thought the use of images implied something so bad as idolatry. So you get at that a little bit through this term, worship of foreign gods. In Rabbinic Hebrew, this would be millennia later, from Biblical Hebrew, you have a similar term, avodah zarah, strange or foreign worship, which has a whole other interesting set of assumptions connected to any kind of worship that is other than us. So you have those terms that look at the concept of idolatry. But what about images themselves? Turns out there's actually a ton of biblical Hebrew terms for images specifically. And you can divide them based on what kind of thing they're commenting on the images. So for example, certain terms are based on the material from which the image is created. So you have pesel, graven image. This is probably the most common term. Molten image. You have stone or wooden image that have their own terms. Then you also have other terms that talk about the image in the context of its relationship with its referent, that is what it is representing. So likeness, tabnit, that shows up in Genesis because humans are created in the image and likeness of God. It's quite interesting that those terms are used in parallel with images as bad things, but then also humans as the image and likeness. And then you have the really funny terms. So Elilim is kind of a made-up word in biblical Hebrew. So Elohim, you may know, is the word for God, but it's combined with this word that means weak, Elil in Hebrew. And so this term Elilim is literally a way of making fun of idols by reference to them being weak or not powerful as God should be. You have this other word, Gililim, which sounds very suspiciously similar to the word for dung pellets. You can colloquialize that if you want. I'll leave that to you. And then shakush, so detestable thing. So notice that a lot of these terms are polemical with regard to images, but not all of them are. And in fact, we'll get back to that when it comes to what does it mean for humans to be created in the image of God. So we spoke already about this two main categories of idolatry in the biblical text. Either you're worshiping the wrong God or you're worshiping the right God in the wrong way. And as you might guess, people disagree on which of these categories a particular act might fall under, which makes things really complicated. So do you remember the golden calf episode? Moses is up getting the 10 Commandments, leaves Aaron in charge. That was a big mistake. He throws all this gold into the fire. Out comes the calf somehow. And that was a bad thing, okay? The biblical author is very, very sure that that's a bad thing and that it constituted a kind of idolatry. But among the reception of this text, it's an ongoing debate about why it was wrong. Was it wrong because the golden calf itself was meant to represent Yahweh? That's one way of understanding it. Or was it wrong because Yahweh was represented, or because a different God was represented by means of the calf? So both of those options are ways of interpreting that text. A complicating factor is that sometimes in the ancient Near East, that is the surrounding culture of ancient Israel, you would have gods be represented by means of not the calf itself, but they would be seated on the calf. So you would find all these figurines of gods riding bulls or calves. And so when this image is used in the Bible, there's a question: is the divine represented by means of the calf? Or is Yahweh sort of invisibly throned on the calf in a way that is parallel to the other ancient Near Eastern cultures? And if you take that approach, it's questionable why it was bad, because Yahweh is supposed to be invisible, right? Technically, that you could say that that's an aniconic form of worship. So I hope what this gets across to you is to call something idolatry, it's not as simple as we might like it to be. There's all sorts of assumptions about representation, divine embodiment, and trying to get into the heads of these ancient peoples who thought in some ways very differently from us, but also had the common human experience of requiring the divine presence. And so I think that this gets at the complicated nature of idolatry in the Bible. So throughout this class, what I'm hoping we can do is, through each session, we have 5 sessions, is to look at the different kinds of categories of texts in the Bible about images. And you can kind of divide these into 3 groups. So in the legal stuff in the Torah and the Pentateuch, there's legal commandments surrounding the use of images. So it's the 10 Commandments, it's Deuteronomy 4. These are places where the law is laid down and there's some level of explanation given as to why. So that's interesting. Then you have a couple of stories in Joshua through Kings, what scholars call the Deuteronomistic history. Again, that's the book of Joshua, Judges, Samuel, and Kings. Ruth is not included in that. And these get at the question of the relationship between images being forbidden, but we actually have stories where images sometimes play a pretty important role. Like in the Ark narrative, the Ark of the Covenant in 1 Samuel 4 through 7, that's kind of an image. It certainly acts very similar to other ancient Near Eastern images. So we'll look at that and we'll see how that kind of fits together with other ideas about images. And then, of course, my favorite, the prophetic material about image makers. The prophets seem to come down the hardest with their not only aniconic, but iconoclastic rhetoric. And so we'll divide it up that way, do like an intro today. Next week, we'll talk about the legal stuff, the 10 Commandments, or is it 10? That's a plug for next week. And then the historical narratives on week 3, prophets week 4, and then week 5, we'll finally be able to take all of that material that we've worked so hard to collate from the ancient world and try to apply that to our modern day world. And we'll talk about modern stuff in between, but that's generally the plan of the class. Oh, I have another question for you. Are you ready? So you told me what idolatry was. Can you tell me why it's bad? What is so bad about images? What was that?
It may separate you from God.
It separates you from God. Okay. Yeah. Why does it separate you?
Because we can't see them.
Ah, okay. So there's something about God's invisibility or lack of accessibility that is important for you as a believer. Okay. Other? Yes. Back there?
Image to what you see, then you can miss all the dimensions of God. You focus just on that, whether it's God's much bigger than the image.
Thank you. Yes, there's a big strand of this thinking about idolatry that is exactly that. It says images are bad because God can't be contained. God is transcendent. What are we doing if we say God, if we're saying God is here, it's a way of limiting God in a way. Thank you. Yes.
Similar thread, but images are static and finite.
Two things that God likes to not be in the Old Testament. Thank you. Any other ideas?
A distraction. They're a distraction from what the image is supposed to be represented.
Yes, there's a philosopher of idolatry that talks about the error of substitution that can sometimes happen when you think about an image as the recipient of your worship, the danger is that that image might substitute for the reality as opposed to merely pointing to it. There's a theologian that talks about the difference between an idol and an icon. We'll talk a bit about that in this class too. Whereas an idol, you gaze at an idol and your gaze comes back to you, back at yourself. The icon, you actually pass through the icon towards God. And so the idea is, does the object serve to enhance your worship, or does it reflect your worship back to yourself? So I think that's what you're getting at with that distraction idea. Any other thoughts? You've already hit on a lot of the big strands of interpretation. I'm impressed. So let me give you a few of the ideas in scholarship around this question. And we might broadly call this question the logic of aniconism. That's what my work is interested in, explaining why is it that images were forbidden, both in the biblical text and in ancient Israel. So the first one we mentioned, Yahweh's too transcendent. Having an image as the locus of attention limits God in a way that is inappropriate for God's nature. Another option, we sort of touched on this, God doesn't stay in one place. If you read through the Old Testament, you notice neither do the Israelites. The Israelites start in Canaan, they go to Egypt, they come back, they're all over the place. They're a nomadic people, archaeologists would say. And images aren't just freestanding things, they actually play a role in a larger socio-political ecosystem. And for a nomadic people, it doesn't make sense to have that infrastructure out in the desert where they are. So for example, we have records from Mesopotamia which quarter off whole fields of grapes these are only to be used for the wine for the offering for the divine image. And so it doesn't really make sense that you could have that much disposable income to create a wine that's just for the divine image if you're a nomadic people. This is also related to the fourth concept, that Yahweh cares about justice and is more egalitarian than surrounding nations, because if you think about the kind of nation that has the amount of infrastructure to create not only offerings for the god, but clothing and fine offerings for the deity, it's not going to be the rich people that are doing this. This requires a certain stratification of society to not only have wine and food to offer for the images, but also to have the workers that are responsible for doing this. And so some people have suggested, look, ancient Israel, being basically a group of misfits that are gathered together from Egypt, they have this more egalitarian mindset, and the existence of a cult of images is sort of anti that. And so there could be this interesting socio-political dimension to the avoidance of images in ancient Israel. The third one that I kind of glossed over is it's more intellectual to not have images. This has kind of been discarded because it's like a little bit racist. You say that it's more intellectual to not worship using images, and it's more, it's better to simply imagine God rather than needing a physical image. This is very wrapped up in sort of ways in which Europeans interacted with the religion of people that they colonized in the last few centuries. And so it's interesting to think about the way that these explanations for aniconism intersect with the socio-political time of the people that actually came up with the explanations. So, and really, behind these four possible explanations, there's still a lot of unknowns among people that look at the Hebrew Bible and ask what exactly was so bad. There seems to be truth in all of them to a certain extent, but there's also a kind of diversity of understanding even within the Hebrew Bible. If you look at the reasoning given against images in Deuteronomy, it's a little bit different from what's given in the prophets. And so there might be different understandings of this depending on the person. So we'll come back to that. Any thoughts on these explanations before we move on? Yeah.
With regard to images, is it related at all Jewish prohibitions against saying God's name in certain ways or spelling out God's name?
Yes, I think that's an excellent question, and I do think that it's related historically, absolutely. So there's one scholar that makes the argument that as ancient Israelite religion morphed into Judaism, what took the place of the image of God was actually the Bible itself. And so you can see that attitude continuing on into some forms of Christianity, where the Bible itself is a sort of locus of devotion. We might call it an idol, some do. But with that is the idea that the written word is a kind of image, specifically the name of Yahweh, which is not to be pronounced within the sacred tradition of Judaism. You're supposed to say Adonai or Hashem. You don't say Yahweh. So my use of that term is solely historical. It is not a devotional use of that term. So thank you. I think that's absolutely related. We'll move forward. So the last part of our time today, we have about 10 minutes left, is I want to talk about attitudes toward images that are present not in ancient Israel, but in the surrounding culture in the ancient Near East. Because as we are learning more and more about the ancient world, we understand ancient Israel didn't live in a vacuum. They were interacting with ideas around them just as we are, just as we interact with our neighbors who might believe differently. And so it's really important for us to have an understanding of what were these ancient practices. So to paint with a little bit of a broad brush, given in our short time here, you can think of images in Mesopotamia as not, the word representation really doesn't give you an accurate understanding of the role of images in Mesopotamia. Our understanding of art in the 21st century West is very distinct from the ideas about agency in art that were present in the ancient world. So we think, for example, there's me, myself, and then there's a picture of me, and these are two different things. The picture, if you were to confuse the picture with me, you would be crazy. That would not be the same thing. But that's because of a particular understanding of ontology that we have in the West that is very anachronistic to the ancient world. And so when you think about images of deities or people or images of anything in the ancient world, you think about it as being part of the same type of thing as the person who is being represented. Yes?
I think when photography was first invented, there were a lot of people who didn't want their photographs taken for that very reason. That just reminds me of that.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and it's very interesting to think about ways in which that attitude still is present even in our communities, but certainly in places throughout the world, this attitude towards images as having some sort of real power or essence, certainly not being, quote, mere representations. And so I think it's helpful for us to think about examples like that, because that brings us a little bit closer to how people in the ancient world would have thought about art. So, for example, an image of a deity in the ancient world would do the same things as the deity itself. It would be a locus of power, it would protect the people, and this production of divine images would naturally be a very highly ritualized process, because you're actually invoking the exact verb you use is a little bit tricky, whether you're creating the god or maturing the god or animating the god or giving birth to the god, but it's in some way a recognition of both the human element and the divine element, bringing that together in the creation of a god. And so one of the most important rituals from Mesopotamia with regard to the production of images is something called the Mis-P. I know it sounds like a person's name. It's a phrase in Akkadian that means the washing of the mouth. So, which is interesting too, right? So the way that they thought about the animation of divine statues was that their mouths had to be ritually purified in order to receive the daily food and drink that would be necessary for them to function as deities. So they had to have their mouth washed and then opened in order to receive those offerings. And you can read through the whole ritual if you want. It's a 2-day long ritual. It's very complicated. And through this process, it's what allows the mere statue constructed of wood or stone to be actually a living, breathing deity in the temple. So that, again, this might seem different from the ways that we think about the agency of statues and of art today, but this would have been the prominent idea about art in the ancient world and the kind of things that, for example, the prophet Isaiah would have been familiar with and interacting with when he's talking about images. So this picture I have here is a picture from Neo-Assyria. It would have been during the biblical period, and it's depicting the ritual of Miss P performed not exactly on a divine statue, but on a sun disk. So sometimes symbols could be used in place of like anthropomorphic deities. But you see the king with a role to play, and you have the temple workers carrying out the various rituals. So this was a very important ritual to the lifestyle and the royal sort of well-being of the people in ancient Mesopotamia. Any thoughts on that or questions? Has anybody heard of God napping? Well, you're going to have another fun thing to talk about at your next party. So this illustrates the fact that divine images were thought of as the deities themselves. So one of the common practices of especially Assyrian, but also Babylonian conquering armies would be their final act after they had conquered the entire army would be to take the divine images from the conquered territory. And you see in this Assyrian relief a picture of those deities being carried back to the conquering territory's home. Interestingly, they wouldn't destroy the statues. Sometimes they would like etch out the facial features, either the eyes or the nose or the mouth, because that was what was considered to be the most important aspect of the statue that enabled the social agency of it. But they would take the deities and sort of God nap them. And that's actually part of what happens in 1 Samuel in the Ark of the Covenant story that we'll talk about. So that is a testament to the fact of how important these deities were to the people that had them. We'll skip that. Okay, the one thing I have to tell you about before we go is another element that points to the importance of images in the ancient world, and that's what's called the substitute king ritual. So, okay, imagine you're a king in ancient Mesopotamia. It's a dangerous time, okay? There's bad omens all over the place. You could get sick, you could die. Lots of things could threaten your well-being. If your diviners figure out, the people that work for you, if they figure out that there's a threat that's coming to you as the king, the well-being of you as the king is very important. So what they would do is perform a ritual. They would take literally a random person sometimes. It could be a farmer, it could be somebody that works in the fields, and they would make him king, okay? And then that person would rule in place of the king who was in danger. And it wasn't that he was representing the king, it was that he actually was the king. And so the idea was that through this, the punishment or the danger that was supposed to befall the real king actually befalls the substitute king, and then the real king can come back in his place. But one time, that didn't happen. So there was one example from 1861 BC. King Era Emeti ruled in what would now be southern Iraq, is reported to have died after eating a very hot bowl of broth. So watch out, okay? This is the real king who died. But he had a substitute king, thankfully, a humble gardener named Enlil Bani, who was still alive. According to legend, he took the king's place and ruled successfully for a further 24 years. So this is all because he had undergone this ritual and did not merely represent the king, but in fact was the king, even though he had no royal lineage, no training, nothing of that. So I share that along with the Miss P ritual to give you a sense that this is a culture in which ritual and animation of statues was considered to have real power. It was not just sort of a celebration in the way that we might think of today. It was not mere circumstance. So with that, that's a pretty short and sweet introduction to the idea of images in the ancient world that the Old Testament authors would have been interacting with. Next week, we'll get into really the texts themselves of the Old Testament. We'll talk about the legal literature and see where we see this idea about images in the Old Testament. So that's all I have for you. I'm happy to stay after and do questions if you want, but otherwise, you're free to go. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Caitlin. I'm afraid I gave her a tough assignment because we got started a little bit later today, and I told her that we had a hard stop at 12:15. But it sounds to me, in the groundwork that you've laid for us today, that we are in for a real treat. And so I'm grateful for all of your being here, and I look forward to continuing on this journey together for the next 4 weeks. And I do invite you, if you do have questions, please let Caitlin know. And thank you so much for being here with us today. We're excited about this.
Thank you.